Chun, my name is Laura Bennett. I'm an archivist with the Boston Historical Society, and I've been researching your family history. I've discovered some information about your grandmother, Clara, and your great-grandmother, Elizabeth, that I believe you should know about. There was a long and pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Then, Margaret spoke, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. My grandmother never spoke about her childhood. She would become visibly upset if we even asked. We knew that her mother had died when she was young, but we never knew any more details than that. What exactly have you found? It's a long story, Mrs. Chun, Laura said, her voice gentle and empathetic. And it's a difficult one, but I truly believe that you deserve to know the truth. May I come and visit you? Yes, Margaret said immediately, her voice firm. Please come tomorrow. Laura arrived at the Newton Retirement Community on a bright and sunny Saturday morning, carefully carrying a folder containing copies of all the documents she had gathered during her research: the haunting photograph, the asylum records, Sarah Cunningham's desperate letters, Elizabeth's death certificate, and the documentation of Clara's tireless advocacy work. Margaret Chun met her in a bright and cheerful visiting room. She was 83 years old, with sharp and intelligent eyes and her grandmother's remarkably straight and dignified posture. Two other people were sitting with her son Daniel and her granddaughter Emma, both of whom had driven in from out of state when Margaret had told them about Laura's unexpected phone call. Laura carefully spread the documents out on the table and began with the photograph. She watched intently as 3 generations of Clara's descendants looked at the terrified faces of their ancestors for the very first time. "My God," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with emotion. She was so young and so incredibly afraid. Laura proceeded to tell them everything. She explained in detail about William Ashworth's embezzlement and fraudulent activities, Elizabeth's accidental discovery of his crimes, and the systematic and cruel way in which he had silenced his wife and forcibly separated her from her daughter. She showed them the asylum records, Sarah Cunningham's desperate attempts to help Elizabeth, and the tragic details of Elizabeth's 11 years of unjust imprisonment at Taunton. Clara was only 7 years old when this photograph was taken, Laura said, her voice filled with sympathy. She spent 3 long years in an orphanage, knowing that her mother was locked away somewhere, but feeling utterly powerless to reach her and help her. When her father finally took her back, she effectively became his housekeeper, trapped in his house until she was old enough to marry and finally escape his control. Margaret was crying softly, tears streaming down her face. "She never told us," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "She never said a word about any of this. She carried all of this pain and trauma completely alone." Daniel, Margaret's son, looking intently at the photograph, added, "All that trauma, and she had no one to talk to about it." Emma, who was in her 30s, spoke up, her voice filled with admiration. "But she did do something," she said, pointing to the documents related to Clara's volunteer work. "Look at this volunteer work. She spent her whole adult life protecting other children. She made sure that other kids didn't suffer the same things that she had suffered." Laura nodded in agreement. "Your grandmother was incredibly brave," she said, "and so was your great-grandmother, Elizabeth." Elizabeth knew that she was going to be silenced, so she deliberately created evidence. This photograph. She made sure that their fear was documented for posterity. She was hoping that someday someone would look at it and understand what had really happened. "And you did," Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze Laura's hand. 127 years later, but someone finally looked. Someone finally saw. They talked for hours, sharing stories and emotions. Laura patiently answered all of their questions, showed them every relevant document, and helped them to understand the complex legal and social context that had allowed William Ashworth to destroy his own family with virtually no consequences. She explained how common this pattern had been during that era, how many women had been unjustly institutionalized by husbands who wanted to silence them, and how many children had been cruelly separated from mothers who loved them. Before Laura left, Emma asked a question that had been forming in her mind throughout the entire conversation. "What happened to William Ashworth?" she asked. Did he ever face justice for what he did? Laura had researched this aspect as well. He died in 1915, she said, a wealthy man, widely respected in his community. His obituary called him a pillar of Boston society and made absolutely no mention of his wife or daughter. He was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery with a large and imposing monument. That's just not right, Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with righteous indignation. No, Laura agreed. It's not. But we have the power to change the narrative now. With your permission, I would like to write Elizabeth and Clara's story. I want to meticulously document what really happened so that history remembers them as survivors, not as forgotten victims. Margaret nodded emphatically, her eyes filled with determination. Yes, she said. Please tell their story. My grandmother deserves to be remembered for her incredible courage, and my great-grandmother deserves to be vindicated. Over the following months, Laura worked closely with the Chin family to create a comprehensive and historically accurate account of Elizabeth and Clara's lives. She published a detailed article in the Journal of Women's History, meticulously documenting the Ashworth case and its broader context within the framework of Victorian-era domestic abuse and institutional control. The Boston Historical Society mounted a powerful exhibition featuring Elizabeth and Clara's haunting photograph alongside their compelling story. The photograph that had once documented terror and injustice ultimately became a symbol of resilience and truth. Visitors stood before it, seeing not just the palpable fear in their eyes, but also their unwavering determination to survive, to document their experiences, and to leave behind a trace of truth for future generations to discover. Margaret Chun attended the exhibition's opening with her children and grandchildren. She stood for a long time in front of the poignant portrait of her grandmother as a frightened 7-year-old child, her eyes filled with tears and a profound sense of connection. We see you now, she whispered, her voice filled with love and respect. Both of you, we see you, and we remember you, and we honor your courage. The photograph had waited 127 long years for someone to truly look at it, to zoom in on those terrified eyes, and to ask the questions that should have been asked back in 1897. Laura had finally given Elizabeth and Clara what they had been denied in life, a voice, a witness, and justice in the form of historical truth and recognition. As visitors filed past the exhibition, reading the heartbreaking story of a mother and daughter who had desperately tried to document their truth through a single photograph, Laura found herself thinking about how many other old portraits might be hiding similar stories, stories of pain, resilience, and injustice. How many other women had left behind silent evidence of their suffering, waiting patiently for someone to finally see and understand. She made a solemn promise to herself that day. She would keep looking. She would keep asking the difficult questions. She would keep zooming in on the seemingly insignificant details that others so often overlooked. Because history, she realized, belonged not just to the powerful men who left behind grand monuments and flattering obituaries, but also to the silenced women and children whose fear, courage, and resilience deserved to be remembered and honored. The photograph of Elizabeth and Clara, taken in March of 1897, had finally fulfilled its intended purpose. It had been seen, it had been believed, and the truth it contained would never be forgotten again. This 1897 studio portrait of a mother and daughter appears peaceful at first glance until your eyes meet theirs. The basement of the Boston Historical Society had that familiar aroma of aged paper and time that slipped through the cracks. Laura Bennett had dedicated 3 years to this place, meticulously cataloging donations that showed up in cardboard boxes and crates thick with dust, each one a tiny doorway to a bygone era. On a frigid February morning in 2024, she cracked open a box with Estate Sale Beacon Hill. Missing her photographs, scrawled on the label. Tucked inside, nestled beneath layers of tissue paper yellowed and fragile with age, were dozens of photographs from the late 1800s. Most were fairly typical of the time. Stiff-backed gentlemen sporting impressive mustaches, kids dressed in their Sunday best, and families gathered on front porches for a photo. Laura had seen countless images like these, But then her fingers brushed against a particular photograph that stopped her in her tracks. It was a professionally done studio portrait, the kind that wealthy families commissioned back in the 1890s. The photographer's mark in the corner read, Whitmore and Sons Studio, Boston, 1897. Two figures filled the frame. A woman in her early 30s, adorned in an elaborate dark dress with a high collar and fancy buttons, and a girl around 7 or 8 years old, wearing a white lace dress, her carefully curled hair adorned with ribbons. They were seated in a plush velvet chair, the daughter on her mother's lap, both posed in the classic, formal Victorian style. Everything about the photograph hinted at prosperity and respectability. The studio backdrop displayed painted columns and gracefully draped curtains. The subjects were dressed in expensive clothing. Their postures were perfect, their hands carefully positioned. In every technical sense, it was a stunning portrait of a refined Boston family. But something fell off. Laura held the photograph closer to her face, tilting it to catch the light from the fluorescent bulbs overhead. The mother and daughter were smiling, or rather, their mouths were arranged in what looked like smiles, just as photographers of that era demanded. Yet their eyes told a completely different story. The mother's eyes were wide, almost unnaturally so, with a fixed stare that suggested not serenity, but a barely suppressed sense of panic. There was a tension around them, a tightness in the muscles of her face that contrasted with the gentle curve of her lips. And the little girl, Laura felt a chill creep down her spine. The little girl's eyes held an expression of pure, silent terror. Her small hands gripped her mother's arm with what appeared to be desperate force, her tiny fingers white against the dark fabric of the dress. Laura had studied thousands of Victorian photographs. She was well aware of the conventions, the long exposure times that force subjects to hold unnaturally still, the discomfort of wearing formal clothing, the general awkwardness many people felt in front of cameras. But this was different. This wasn't just the stiffness of Victorian formality. This was fear, captured and preserved for over a century. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, Elizabeth and Clara, March 1897. May God forgive us. Laura's heart began to race. She pulled out her phone and snapped several high-resolution photos of the portrait, zooming in on the faces, the hands, every detail. Then, she opened her laptop and started searching the Historical Society's digital archives for any mention of Elizabeth and Clara from 1897 Boston. The investigation had officially begun. Laura spent the remainder of that day combing through the Historical Society's databases, but the names Elizabeth and Clara were, frustratingly, quite common in 1890s Boston. Without a last name, she didn't have much to go on. She examined the photograph again under a magnifying glass, searching for any additional clues she might have missed. The studio mark, Whitmore and Sons, was her best lead. She searched the Society's records for information about photography studios that operated in Boston during that period. After an hour of sifting through business directories and old newspaper advertisements, she finally found something. Whitmore and Sons Studio had been located on Tremont Street from 1889 to 1902, catering to Boston's wealthy elite. The clothing in the photograph offered more clues. The mother's dress, with its leg of mutton sleeves and elaborate trim, was expensive and quite fashionable for 1897. The little girl's white dress, too, spoke of wealth. White clothing was impractical and required servants to maintain its pristine condition. These weren't middle-class Bostonians. They were from the upper echelons of society, likely residents of Beacon Hill or the Back Bay. Laura leaned back in her chair, thinking that if they were wealthy, there ought to be records. Birth announcements, mentions in the society pages, property records, something. She opened the digitized archives of the Boston Globe and began searching editions from 1897, focusing on the social columns that documented the activities of prominent families. For hours, she scrolled through microfilm scans, her eyes straining against the old-fashioned typeface, reading about charity events, dinner parties, arrivals and departures, the minute details of upper-class Boston life. Then, in the March 15, 1897 edition, she found something that made her sit up straight. A small notice, buried on page 7, Mrs. Elizabeth Ashworth and daughter Clara have departed the city for an extended rest. Mrs. Ashworth's health has been delicate of late, and the family seeks the restorative benefits of country air. Ashworth, finally, a last name. Laura's fingers flew across the keyboard. She searched for more mentions of the Ashworth family, and what she found painted a picture of Boston aristocracy. William Ashworth was listed in the 1895 city directory as a banker with a residence on Mount Vernon Street in the heart of Beacon Hill. He served on the boards of multiple charitable organizations and was frequently mentioned in connection with the city's financial elite. But after that brief March 1897 notice about Elizabeth and Clara's departure, mentions of Elizabeth vanished from the society pages. William Ashworth continued to appear at bank meetings, charitable events, and gentlemen's clubs, but always alone. No wife accompanied him. No daughter was mentioned. Laura felt that familiar tingle of a mystery deepening. She grabbed a notepad and started listing what she knew. Elizabeth and Clara had their portrait taken in March 1897, possibly just before leaving the city. The photograph showed clear signs of distress. Elizabeth's health was described as delicate, a Victorian euphemism that could mean anything from genuine illness to depression, or even something far darker. And then, both mother and daughter seemed to disappear from Boston society entirely. She needed more information. She needed to find out what happened to Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth after they left the city in March 1897. And she needed to understand why someone had written, "May God forgive us," on the back of their photograph. Laura glanced at the clock. It was nearly 6 o'clock in the evening, and the Historical Society would be closing soon, but she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep without learning more. She gathered her notes, carefully placed the photograph in an archival sleeve, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would visit the Massachusetts State Archives. If Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth had met with tragedy, there would be records, death certificates, asylum admissions, court proceedings. The story hidden in those terrified eyes was waiting to be uncovered, and Laura was determined to find it. The Massachusetts State Archives occupied a modern building in Dorchester, its climate-controlled rooms a stark contrast to the dusty basement where Laura usually worked. She arrived early on Wednesday morning, armed with her notebook, the photograph, and a list of record types she needed to examine. Vital records, asylum admissions, and court documents from 1897 to 1900. The archivist at the front desk, a middle-aged man named Robert, examined her research request with interest. "The Ashworth family from Beacon Hill," he said, adjusting his glasses. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. What's your angle?" Laura showed him the photograph. "I'm trying to find out what happened to this woman and her daughter. They disappeared from public records in March 1897. Robert studied the image, his expression growing somber as he noticed the fear in their eyes. "Victorian Boston had ways of making inconvenient women disappear," he said quietly. "Let me pull what we have." An hour later, Laura sat at a research table surrounded by document boxes. She started with death certificates, hoping she wouldn't find what she was looking for. She scanned through dozens of entries from March through December 1897, her finger tracing down columns of names. No Elizabeth Ashworth, no Clara Ashworth. Relief mixed with frustration. They hadn't died, at least not in Massachusetts in 1897, but that meant they had gone somewhere else. She moved on to the asylum records. Massachusetts had several institutions in the late 19th century where wealthy families could quietly commit troublesome relatives: McLean Hospital in Belmont, the Boston Lunatic Hospital, Taunton State Hospital. The admission records were incomplete, many pages damaged or missing. But Laura worked through them methodically. In the McLean Hospital ledger for April 1897, she found it. Elizabeth Ashworth, age 32, admitted April 12, 1897. Committed by husband, William Ashworth. Diagnosis: hysteria and melancholia. Patient displays agitation and makes unfounded accusations against family members. Laura's hands trembled as she photographed the page. Hysteria, the catch-all diagnosis Victorian doctors used to dismiss women's legitimate complaints and unfounded accusations. What had Elizabeth tried to tell people? What had she accused her husband of? She searched for any record of Elizabeth's release or transfer but found nothing. The ledger simply stopped mentioning her after June 1897. No discharge date, no death recorded. Elizabeth Ashworth had entered McLean Hospital and vanished from official records. But what about Clara? Laura's stomach tightened with dread as she turned to juvenile records. If William Ashworth had committed his wife to an asylum, what had he done with their 7-year-old daughter? The records for the Boston Female Asylum, an institution that housed orphaned and dependent children, provided the answer. Clara Ashworth, age 7, admitted March 20th, 1897. Father unable to care for child due to mother's illness. Child is quiet and compliant but suffers from nightmares. March 20th, just days after the photograph was taken and weeks before Elizabeth was committed to McLean. William Ashworth had separated them almost immediately. Laura sat back, piecing together the timeline. Something had happened in the Ashworth household in early March 1897. Elizabeth had taken Clara to Whitmore and Son studio to have their portrait made, a portrait that captured their terror in a way words never could. Within days, Clara had been placed in an orphanage. Within weeks, Elizabeth had been committed to an asylum for making unfounded accusations. The photograph, there hadn't been a typical family portrait. It had been evidence. Elizabeth had known what was coming, and she had created a record of their fear, a silent testimony preserved in silver and paper. Laura needed to find out what happened next. She needed court records, property transfers, anything that would tell her how William Ashworth had managed to erase his wife and daughter from his life so completely. And she needed to find out if Clara had survived, if she'd ever been reunited with her mother, if anyone had ever believed them. Laura spent the next 2 days buried in property records and legal documents at the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. The trail of William Ashworth's financial dealings painted a picture of a man who valued control above all else. In 1893, William had inherited his father's banking firm, Ashworth and Company, along with the Mount Vernon Street mansion. The business had been prosperous, handling accounts for some of Boston's wealthiest families. But Laura found something odd in the ledgers. In early 1897, just weeks before Elizabeth and Clara's photograph, several of the bank's largest clients had quietly withdrawn their accounts. She cross-referenced the names with newspaper archives and found a small item in the Boston Herald from February 1897. Several prominent families have elected to transfer their banking relationships following concerns about management practices at Ashworth and Company. Mr. William Ashworth declined to comment on the matter. What kind of concerns? Laura searched for more details but found only vague references to irregularities and questions of propriety. In Victorian Boston, such euphemistic language could mean anything from minor accounting errors to serious fraud. Then she found the court records. In June 1897, 2 months after Elizabeth was committed, 3 former clients had filed a civil suit against William Ashworth, alleging misappropriation of funds. The case had been quietly settled out of court, with all parties agreeing to seal the records. Whatever William had done, someone with power and money had helped him bury it. Laura leaned back in her chair, the pieces beginning to fit together. William had been embezzling from his clients. Elizabeth had discovered it. And when she had threatened to expose him, when she had made what the asylum records called unfounded accusations, he had used the full weight of Victorian patriarchal law to silence her. A husband in 1897 had near absolute power over his wife. He could commit her to an asylum without proof of illness. He could control all her property. He could deny her access to her children. And society, especially wealthy Boston society, would support him, would assume the woman was the problem, that her mind was weak, that she was hysterical. Laura felt a surge of anger for Elizabeth, trapped in an era that gave her no voice, no protection, no way to fight back except through a photograph that documented her terror. She needed to find out what happened next. The asylum records had stopped mentioning Elizabeth in June 1897. Had she died there? Had she been transferred elsewhere? And what about Clara? Had she remained in the orphanage, or had William eventually reclaimed her? Laura returned to McLean Hospital's records, this time requesting access to patient death records and transfer logs. The archivist brought her a leather-bound volume marked Deceased and transferred 1897 to 1900. She found Elizabeth's name on a transfer record dated July 15, 1897. Elizabeth Ashworth transferred to Taunton State Hospital. Patient remains agitated and resistant to treatment. Prognosis poor. Taunton, Laura's heart sank. Taunton State Hospital had been notorious in the late 19th century as a place where inconvenient family members were sent to disappear. Unlike McLean, which catered to wealthy families with some pretense of therapeutic care, Taunton was overcrowded, underfunded, and had a reputation for harsh treatment. William Ashworth had moved his wife from a relatively comfortable private institution to a state asylum where she would be forgotten, where her voice would be lost among hundreds of other institutionalized women, where no one from her former life would think to look for her. Laura made copies of every document she had found, building a case file that would have made any prosecutor proud. But she wasn't done. She needed to follow Elizabeth to Taunton to find out if she had survived, if she had ever escaped, if she had ever seen her daughter again. And she needed to find out what had happened to Clara. The Boston Female Asylum's records were housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Laura spent Thursday morning navigating their collection. The asylum had closed in 1954, its records transferred to various archives, but the society had managed to preserve the admission ledgers and some correspondence. Clara's file was thin, just a few pages that documented a 7-year-old girl's entry into institutional life. The initial admission form, dated March 20th, 1897, listed her father as her only living relative. Her mother was described simply as indisposed due to illness, but it was the matron's notes, written in neat cursive across subsequent pages, that broke Laura's heart. March 25th. Clara remains withdrawn. She does not play with other children and speaks rarely. At night, she calls for her mother. April 10th. The child's nightmares persist. She wakes screaming and cannot be consoled. Dr. Morrison recommends a sedative tonic. May 3rd. Clara asked again when her mother will come for her. I told her to pray and be patient. The child is bright but melancholy. Laura had to stop reading for a moment, blinking back tears. 7 years old, separated from her mother, trapped in an institution, not understanding why she had been abandoned. And Elizabeth, locked away in an asylum, powerless to reach her daughter, perhaps not even knowing where Clara had been taken. She continued reading. The notes became less frequent as months passed, Clara fading into the institutional routine. But then, in September 1897, something changed. September 18th, received inquiry from Mrs. Sarah Cunningham regarding Clara Ashworth. Mrs. Cunningham claims to be the child's maternal aunt and wishes to discuss Clara's situation. Laura's pulse quickened. An aunt, someone from Elizabeth's side of the family. She searched the records for more information about Sarah Cunningham and found a series of letters carefully preserved in the file. The first letter, dated September 15th, 1897, was written in elegant script to the directress of the Boston Female Asylum. I am writing to inquire about my niece, Clara Ashworth, who I understand has been placed in your institution. I have only recently learned of my sister Elizabeth's situation and my niece's placement. I wish to visit Clara and discuss arrangements for her care. I reside in Cambridge and am prepared to provide a suitable home. The response from the asylum was cautious. We must consult with the child's father, Mr. William Ashworth, before allowing visits or discussing placement changes. Then came Sarah Cunningham's reply, dated September 30th. I have attempted to contact Mr. Ashworth multiple times without success. His secretary claims he is too occupied with business to address family matters. I must insist on my right to see my sister's child. Elizabeth would want me to ensure Clara's well-being. I am fast. The correspondence continued for weeks, Sarah Cunningham becoming increasingly urgent in her demands, the asylum becoming increasingly evasive. Then, in late October, a curt note from William Ashworth himself, dictated to his secretary. Miss Sarah Cunningham is not to be granted access to my daughter. She is a spinster of unstable temperament who has filled my wife's head with unreasonable ideas. Any further interference from Miss Cunningham will be met with legal action. After that, the letters stopped. Sarah Cunningham vanished from Clara's file as completely as Elizabeth had vanished from public records. But Laura now had another name, another thread to follow. She searched Boston City directories for Sarah Cunningham and found an address in Cambridge, 47 Brattle Street. The notation listed her occupation as teacher. A teacher, a woman with her own income, her own residence, independent enough to challenge William Ashworth, a woman who had tried to rescue her niece and had been threatened into silence. Laura needed to find out what had happened to Sarah Cunningham. Had she given up after William's threats, or had she continued to fight for Clara in other ways? And most importantly, had she known about Elizabeth's commitment to Taunton? Had she tried to help her sister as well? The investigation was expanding, revealing a web of silenced women, all connected by one powerful man who had used law and social convention to maintain his control. Laura decided she needed help. This investigation had grown beyond a simple historical puzzle. It was becoming a story of systemic injustice that deserved proper documentation. She contacted her colleague, Dr. Marcus Green, a historian who specialized in Victorian-era social institutions and gender studies. They met at a coffee shop near Harvard Square, and Laura spread out copies of all the documents she had gathered. Marcus studied them carefully, his expression growing darker as he read through asylum records, court documents, and Sarah Cunningham's desperate letters. "This is devastating," he said finally, "but not uncommon. Men like William Ashworth had enormous power. The legal system was designed to protect them, not their wives or children." He tapped Sarah Cunningham's letters. This aunt, though, she was brave. Challenging a man of Ashworth's standing could have destroyed her professionally. Schools didn't keep teachers who caused scandals. "Can you help me find out what happened to her?" Laura asked. Marcus nodded. "Cambridge has excellent records. And if she was a teacher, there might be school board minutes, employment records. Let me make some calls." 2 days later, Marcus contacted Laura with news. He had found Sarah Cunningham's employment records at the Cambridge Public Library's historical collection. She had taught at the Agassiz School on Sacramento Street from 1890 to 1898. Her employment had ended abruptly in November 1897, just weeks after William Ashworth's threatening letter, with the notation, "Resigned for personal reasons." But Marcus had found something more valuable, a collection of Sarah Cunningham's personal papers donated to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe College by her grandniece in 1975. The collection included diaries, correspondence, and teaching materials. Laura and Marcus obtained permission to examine the collection, and on a rainy Tuesday morning, they sat together in the library's reading room, carefully opening boxes that had been sealed for decades. Sarah Cunningham's diary entries from 1897 were a revelation. Written in tiny, precise handwriting, they documented a woman's desperate attempt to save her sister and niece from a man she described as a tyrant who wears respectability like a mask. August 15, 1897. "I have finally learned where Elizabeth is. McLean Hospital, then transferred to Taunton. Taunton, a terrible place. I wrote to her immediately, but have received no reply. I fear her letters are being intercepted." September 2, 1897. "I went to see William. He would not admit me to the house. His secretary delivered a message. I am not to interfere in family matters." Family matters. As if imprisoning one's wife in an asylum and abandoning one's child is a private concern. September 20, 1897. "I have retained a lawyer, Mr. Petton, who specializes in family law. He says the situation is difficult. William has complete legal authority over both Elizabeth and Clara. Unless we can prove he is unfit or that Elizabeth is being held unlawfully, the courts will not intervene. But how can we prove anything when all the power resides with him?" October 10, 1897. "I visited Clara today at the asylum. They finally permitted it after Mr. Petton sent them a formal letter. The child is thin and sad, with dark circles under her eyes. She asked about her mother constantly. I wanted to take her home with me immediately, but the matron says William's permission is required. Clara gave me something, a small drawing she had made, hidden in her pocket. It shows a house with bars on the windows. She whispered, "This is where Mama is." How does the child know? Has Elizabeth found a way to send her messages? Laura felt tears welling up. Clara had known. Somehow, despite the separation, despite all of William's efforts to isolate them, the 7-year-old child had known her mother was imprisoned. Marcus pointed to an entry from November 1897. Look at this. November 8th, 1897. I have made a terrible decision. Mr. Peton says our legal options are exhausted. The courts will not act. Society will not condemn a wealthy banker based on a woman's accusations. But I cannot abandon Elizabeth and Clara to this fate. Tomorrow I will travel to Taunton. I will see my sister, and I will find a way to free her, even if it costs me everything. The diary entries ended there. The next pages had been torn out. Laura and Marcus spent hours searching through the rest of Sarah Cunningham's papers, looking for any indication of what had happened during her visit to Taunton State Hospital. They found scattered letters, teaching notes, personal correspondence, but nothing that explained the missing diary pages or what Sarah had discovered there. Then, at the bottom of the last box, Marcus found a slim envelope marked private, not to be opened until after my death. Inside was a letter dated December 1897, written in Sarah's handwriting but unsigned, as if she had been too afraid to claim authorship. Even within her own personal papers, Laura found the damning details. She began reading aloud. I traveled to Taunton on November 9th, 1897. The institution was truly a nightmare. The wards were incredibly overcrowded. The pervasive stench of unwashed bodies filled the air, and the sound of despair, of constant screaming, echoed endlessly through the corridors. I presented myself as Elizabeth's sister and insisted on seeing her immediately. The superintendent initially tried to deny my request, but I threatened to expose the deplorable conditions I was witnessing to every newspaper in Boston. Eventually, they relented and brought her to me in a small, sterile visiting room. I could barely recognize my own sister. She had lost a significant amount of weight, her hair was crudely cut short, and she was wearing a stained, ill-fitting institutional dress. But her eyes, despite everything, were still sharp, still intelligent. She was not insane. She had never been insane. Elizabeth grabbed my hands tightly and began to speak rapidly, as if she feared we would be interrupted at any moment. She told me everything in great detail. William had been systematically stealing from his clients for years, falsifying financial records and creating elaborate fake investments to cover his tracks. She had discovered his deceit quite by accident in February of 1897, stumbling upon incriminating documents he had hidden within his study. When she confronted him with her discovery, he immediately threatened her. When she declared that she would go to the authorities and report him, he simply laughed and told her that no one would ever believe a woman over her own respected husband. He had clearly planned everything with meticulous care. First, he sent Clara away to the orphanage, cynically using Elizabeth's supposed illness as his justification. Then, he coerced 2 doctors, men who were heavily indebted to him, to sign the commitment papers, falsely declaring Elizabeth to be mentally unsound. Within a matter of days, she was committed to Milan. When she continued to vehemently insist on her sanity and repeatedly demanded to see a lawyer, they transferred her to Taunton, where her pleas and protests would be effectively lost and ignored amidst the cries of the genuinely ill. Elizabeth desperately begged me to take Clara, to get her daughter far away from William's influence. She said he was not only a thief, but also a deeply cruel man, that his temper was volatile and violent, and that Clara had already witnessed things that no child should ever have to see. That, she explained, was the reason they both looked so utterly terrified in their photograph. They had gone to the photography studio the day after William had discovered that Elizabeth was asking probing questions about his business dealings. The portrait, she revealed, was her insurance policy, her undeniable evidence that something was terribly wrong, should anyone ever think to investigate. Before I could even respond to her pleas, the attendants brusquely came and took Elizabeth away. As they led her away, she called back to me, Save Clara, and the photograph. Make someone see the truth. I left Taunton completely shaken and determined to take action immediately. But when I returned to my home, I found William's lawyer already waiting for me. He presented me with a stack of legal papers, official documents accusing me of defamation and libel, and threatening my job and my professional reputation. He warned me that if I continued to spread these so-called lies about Mr. Ashworth, I would face serious legal prosecution. He informed me that the school board had already been contacted, and that my position was now under formal review. I am trapped, just as surely as Elizabeth is. I have absolutely no money to engage in a prolonged and expensive legal battle. I have no husband or father to lend credibility and weight to my testimony. I am simply a single, unmarried schoolteacher making what will be perceived as wild and unsubstantiated accusations against a highly respected banker. Society will undoubtedly destroy me long before it ever bothers to question him or his actions. The letter abruptly ended there. Laura carefully set it down on the table, her hands trembling with a mixture of intense rage and profound grief. She simply gave up, Marcus said quietly, understanding the hopelessness of the situation. She felt she had absolutely no other choice. But Clara, Laura responded, her voice filled with concern. What ultimately happened to Clara? They turned their attention back to the asylum's historical records, searching for any further information. The records showed that Clara remained at the Boston Female Asylum until 1900, when she reached the age of 10. Then, her name vanished from the ledgers, replaced with a simple, terse notation, discharged to father's custody. William Ashworth had taken his daughter back after a separation of 3 long years. Had he been overcome with a sense of guilt or remorse? Had he merely needed to maintain a certain public appearance? Or had he simply required a child to manage his household after finally abandoning any pretense of his wife's eventual return? Laura exhaustively searched through old Boston City directories and census records, hoping to piece together Clara's fate. In the 1900 census, William Ashworth was listed as residing at the Mount Vernon Street address with only one dependent, Clara Ashworth, age 10. Notably, no servants were mentioned, which was highly unusual for a household with that level of wealth. By the time of the 1910 census, Clara was 20 years old and still living with her father. Her listed occupation was none, indicating she was unemployed. She had essentially become her father's housekeeper, a captive in a different way than her mother had been. "We need to find out if Clara ever managed to escape," Laura said, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to know if she ever learned the truth about her mother, if anyone ever actually believed them." Marcus pulled up marriage records on his laptop, quickly searching for Clara's name. Clara Ashworth. Clara Ashworth. Here she is. She was married in 1912 to a man named James Whitfield, who worked as a clerk. They moved to Dorchester. Laura felt a surge of hope and relief wash over her. Clara had managed to get away from William and establish her own life. But had she ever learned the truth about what had happened to her mother? Had anyone ever told her the full story? Laura knew that she needed to fully understand Elizabeth's story before she could effectively trace Clara's later life. She decided to travel to Taunton, where the old state hospital building still stood, now repurposed and converted into apartments and offices. The modern archive was housed within a small museum dedicated to the history of mental health treatment in Massachusetts. The archivist, a young woman named Teresa, was incredibly helpful in assisting Laura to navigate the old and often disorganized records. "These files are truly heartbreaking," Teresa remarked, as she pulled out the ledgers from the period between 1897 and 1900. So many women were committed for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with genuine mental illness. Elizabeth's file was surprisingly thicker than Laura had anticipated. It contained detailed medical notes, treatment records, and extensive correspondence. Laura meticulously photographed each page, her anger and indignation growing with each passing document as she read about the casual cruelty that had been so meticulously documented. The notes described Elizabeth as agitated, uncooperative, and delusional. Her so-called delusions consisted of her persistent insistence that she was not ill, her repeated demands to see a lawyer, and her unwavering claim that her husband had committed fraud. The treatments that had been prescribed, cold baths, forced isolation, and heavy sedative drugs, were, in reality, nothing more than thinly disguised punishments. But Elizabeth had been remarkably resilient. Month after month, the notes revealed her maintaining her sanity and lucidity despite everything that was being done to her. Patient continues to be articulate and organized in her thinking. One note read, though content remains delusional. In other words, Elizabeth spoke coherently and rationally, but the doctors simply refused to believe her. Then, Laura found a note from January 1898 that made her heart sink with despair. Patient has grown increasingly despondent, it stated. She no longer speaks of her previous accusations. She now spends hours simply staring out the window. Dr. Hammond, one of the physicians, believed that the reality of her situation has finally begun to break through her defensive delusions. Elizabeth had finally broken, not because she was genuinely mentally ill, but because the system had effectively crushed her spirit. She had been imprisoned for nearly a year, forcibly separated from her beloved daughter, prevented from defending herself against the false accusations, and drugged into a state of submission. The file indicated that she lived at Taunton for 11 more agonizing years. 11 years of institutional life, of lost identity, of a slow and deliberate erasure of her very being. The notes became increasingly briefer and more impersonal over time, reflecting Elizabeth fading into just another aging female patient. Her story was gradually forgotten, and her voice was ultimately silenced. Laura finally found the death certificate, dated March 3, 1909. Elizabeth had been only 44 years old when she died. The cause of death was officially listed as pneumonia, but Laura knew the true cause. She had been killed by a corrupt system that allowed husbands to imprison their wives with impunity and by a society that steadfastly refused to question male authority. Elizabeth had died without ever seeing her daughter again. She had died without anyone ever believing her accusations against William. She had died without ever receiving justice. But she had left behind that photograph, that single, powerful portrait of a terrified mother and daughter. Their eyes served as a stark and enduring record of a truth that no one had been willing to acknowledge back in 1897. And now, 127 years later, someone was finally looking. Laura wiped her eyes, fighting back tears, and turned to the question that had haunted her from the very beginning. Had Clara known? Had anyone ever told her what had really happened to her mother? She knew she needed to find Clara's descendants. If Clara had children or grandchildren, they deserved to know the truth about their grandmother and great-grandmother. They deserved to know that Elizabeth and Clara had been the victims, not of some unfortunate illness, but of one man's ruthless determination to silence them both. Back in Boston, Laura threw herself into the task of tracing Clara's later life, hoping to find any clue that might lead her to the truth. The woman who had married James Whitfield in 1912 had lived in Dorchester until 1918, according to the city directories. But then, the trail abruptly went cold. There were no property records, no further directory listings, and no readily apparent birth records for any children. Marcus suggested that they search through newspaper archives for any mention of Clara Whitfield or Clara Ashworth, hoping to find some piece of information that might shed light on her life. After hours of painstakingly scanning through old microfilm, they finally found a small obituary in the Boston Globe from January 1952. Clara Whitfield, aged 62, died at her home in Quincy on January 14th, it read. She is survived by her husband, James Whitfield, and a daughter, Margaret. Mrs. Whitfield was known for her volunteer work with the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Private services were held. Laura read the obituary 3 times, her mind racing as she absorbed the information. Clara had dedicated her life to protecting children. Had that deeply personal choice been influenced by her own childhood trauma, by being forcibly separated from her mother and unjustly institutionalized? The mention of a daughter, Margaret, gave Laura a promising new lead to pursue. If Margaret was still alive, she would be somewhere in her 70s or 80s. There might still be time to connect her with the truth about her grandmother's tragic fate. Marcus searched genealogy databases, while Laura contacted the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, hoping that they might have records of Clara's volunteer work and involvement. The organization had merged with other child welfare agencies decades ago, but they helpfully referred her to the Boston Children's Services Archive. There, in a dusty box of volunteer records from the 1930s and 40s, Laura found Clara's file. It contained heartfelt letters she had written advocating for individual children, detailed reports on her home visits, and powerful testimony she had given in court cases involving child neglect and abuse. One particular letter, dated 1935, immediately stood out to Laura. Clara had written to a judge on behalf of a young girl whose father wanted to commit her to an institution, echoing her own mother's fate. "Your Honor," she wrote, "I know from personal experience how easily a child can be unjustly separated from a loving parent and labeled as troublesome or difficult, when the real problem lies with those in power. I implore you to investigate this case thoroughly and listen carefully to the child's voice, not simply accept the father's biased account. Children cannot effectively defend themselves against adult authority. The law must protect them, especially when their own parents will not." Laura felt her throat tighten with emotion as she read Clara's impassioned words. Clara had clearly never forgotten her own experiences. She had dedicated her entire adult life to fighting for other children because no one had fought for her when she needed it most. But had Clara known the full and devastating truth about what had happened to her mother? The letter strongly suggested that she understood something about unjust separations and the abuse of power, but did she know about the embezzlement, the forced commitment, and the 11 long years Elizabeth had spent confined at Taunton? Marcus found Margaret Whitfield's marriage record. It showed that she had married David Chun in 1975. Further searches revealed that Margaret was still alive and residing in a retirement community in Newton. Laura's hands shook as she carefully wrote down the address, the culmination of weeks of relentless investigation finally within her reach. After weeks of following faint trails through the dusty pages of history, she was finally about to connect the distant past with the present. She picked up the phone, called the retirement community, and asked to be connected to Margaret Chun. An elderly woman with a clear and strong voice answered, "Hello, this is Mrs. Chun." "Mrs.